Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot. Today we'll be exploring one of my favorite topics when it comes to working with tarot and oracle together, and that is creating combinations. We'll take a look at how I select deck combinations visually, energetically, thematically, and intentionally. So I'm often asked how I go about selecting which tarot and oracle decks that I will pair together. So today I'm going to talk about the 4 different factors that kind of play into how I select the tarot and oracle decks that I work with together. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is visually, and that's matching colors and art styles together. So here we have the Magical Herb Oracle and the Thelema Tarot, which we've seen quite a bit already so far. So when it comes to matching decks visually, what we're really looking for is complementary color palettes and art styles. So you can see here in these two decks that they both have a very high contrast in their art. We get a lot of the kind of grays and whites with those pops of color over the top. So you can see here that we just get a wonderful visual cohesiveness between the two decks. They look like they belong together, and that's kind of one of the main things when you're looking to pair decks visually that you're looking for. For me, that's not the only consideration when I pair an oracle and a tarot deck together, but it definitely does factor into what decks I think will work well together. If they visually have the same sort of aesthetic, the same sort of color palette, maybe even the same art style, then they tend to work really well together. They tend to look beautiful together on your table, but more than that, they tend to kind of intermingle and converse more succinctly. So here we have Death and Change. How beautiful is that? So when looking at, the cards visually, we're just really looking for cards that look pretty together on the table, right? But we're also looking for similar art styles. We're looking for compatible colors. We're looking for, or perhaps contrasting colors. Sometimes that works really well too. So you see here we have the 4 of Swords, Soothe, and the 6 of Cups. So those, you can see that we're picking up the colors. We have a lot of green and gray in both of these decks. We're definitely keying in on that color palette idea. Even the borders, at the bottom borders of this deck are green. Like the backs even match. But really what we're looking at when we're creating a visual combination is that we're looking for those similar color palettes. All of these cards have gray. All of these cards have green. All of these cards have white. Those 3 colors really feature heavily in both of these decks. You could even say this little kind of beigey color here. That also features in all of these cards. You can see here, even in some of these that have a lot of like red tones or blue tones to them, they do still match because coloration, the saturation, and the contrast on both of these decks is pretty similar. And then we're also looking at the fact that they're both photo collage decks. So that helps quite a bit because we're talking about the same basic art style executed in 2 different ways. I mean, here we have full scenes depicted with the collaging, and here we just have the element with some sort of illustrations behind it, the photo herb on top, and then, the background, of course, and then the border itself. But executed in 2 different ways, but still using the same basic technique of that photo collaging, not taking elements together to create one cohesive image. And whether you're doing it in a full scene, like we see here in the Thelema Tarot, or in, a little bit more abstract version like we see here in the Magical Herb, we still definitely get the sense that they're both using the same art style. Now, another thing that I tend to look at when I am looking at decks to pair together is the vibe or the energy of the deck. So now we're talking about decks that, while they do visually connect as well, they also sort of energetically connect. So here we have the Tarot de St. Croix and the Empathetic Oracle. So when we're looking at the decks energetically, really what we're looking for is the vibe or the energy of the deck. And you can see here that these 2 decks have fairly cohesive art styles. They're both hand-drawn. The empathetic oracles may be a little bit more primal, a little bit more raw. The colors do go together because blue and orange are complementary colors, but really what we're looking for is that energy of the decks. So the Tarot de St. Croix is a very earthy, multicultural, kind of grounded tarot deck. And the empathetic oracle really is the same. It's a bit more primal in terms of its art style, but it's also very grounded. And so these two decks together work really well because on a energetic level, the base or the foundational energy of the two decks are really cohesive. The messages, of course, also need to be cohesive in order for the reading itself to make sense. So here we have the Two of Swords and the mountains. Now we would need to look up in the guidebook to see what the mountains actually mean, but we could use whatever the meanings are attributed to the oracle cards and see how that message plays out. You can see here we have the Sun card, and there's also a sun up here. So while they don't necessarily have the same art style or even have really matching colors, they more have complementary colors than actually like matchy colors. We can see here that there are representations in the images that help to capture the energy of the deck. And the energy of each card. So here we have the sun, we have a sun here, we have the dark figure, we have the black here. So we can see how visually they also pair together, but really more what we're tapping into with this particular pairing is the energy of the deck. What we're looking for here is the oracle deck to really provide the base energy. So the energy of this reading would be focus. That's our energy. And the energy that is expanding outward into our Seven of Wands and our Page of Pentacles to help cultivate that reading. And using decks that really have a cohesive and complementary energy really helps to create that dialogue in a really powerful way. So here we have purity with the Nine of Swords and the Knight of Wands. So this is really all about purifying those thoughts that are holding us back. That's the energy, right? We need to purify those thoughts so that we can take that time to look inward. So we see here that these two decks really do complement each other in terms of their energy because they do have a similar sort of grounded earthy energy to them. So here we have the card of Hero with Nine of Cups and Ten of Pentacles. This is all about stepping into your own power. It's all about being your own hero. So you can see here that it's not so much visually, although these two decks do work together pretty well visually. It's more about the energy of the decks. So another way we might consider which two decks to work with together is to look at the theme of the deck. So a lot of times decks have certain themes. So here we have the Green Witch Tarot, which definitely has a green witch vibe to it. And here we have the Hedge Witch Botanical Oracle. So again, another sort of green witchy type of energy or type of theme in this deck. So when we're looking at decks thematically, what we're really looking for is decks that have a similar content, right? A similar theme. And while the artwork doesn't necessarily go together, we're not really talking about energetically or visually, we're talking more about thematically. How the decks work together because they follow the same theme. These two decks also show us a wonderful example of how the decks can be totally opposite of each other and really work well together. So here in the Green Witch Tarot, we have these really full color, full blown illustrations for each of the cards. And in the Hedge Witch Botanical, we have very simple illustrations, gorgeously rendered, but very minimalistic. And they really work together well because they complement each other. Again, we're talking about sort of the opposites attract type of thing, where we have this kind of really busy, fully illustrated image with the more minimalistic image with the white space in the oracle. And I found that this also helps to create space in a reading, which is something that we'll talk about later on as well. So here we're also looking at the messages that come together. So here we have the High Priest and Patience. Right? Those two need to go together. The Nine of Pentacles and Protection. The Star with Stabilize. It's really beautiful pairings. And I love using decks that kind of have the same theme together. Although I would say that matching decks by theme as in like using witchy decks together, or using vintage decks together, or using shamanic decks together. That is probably the least of the considerations that I take into account when I'm pairing my tarot and oracle. I'm more looking at it to visually speak to each other, to energetically speak to each other, and then for the messages to be really cohesive. Those are my main points when it comes to how I pair my tarot and oracle decks. Those are the main things that I look for. If they go together thematically, that works as well, but it's not really one of my focal points. For me, in this particular instance, although we are talking about how decks pair thematically, what I would look for in this pairing is actually that they are the opposites of each other. So they're complementary, because this is a very heavily illustrated, kind of almost busy deck in a sense, compared to the Hedge Witch Botanical, which is a bit more calm with this lot of white space. And so I would be looking at these two decks as a way to complement each other, as in the Green Witch providing the main message of the deck, and the Hedge Witch Botanical to create just an energy for the deck. It creates calm and it creates space. So one of the things that you'll notice about using decks thematically is that they tend to all have the same kind of message. So here we have, messages that are very kind of rooted into the earth, rooted into that kind of green witchery energy. And then see, we have the message of regenerate. And again, these images themselves also really relate to that idea of kind of down in the earth, right? Kind of like tapping into the energy of nature itself to really help us explore the message. So here we have the Three of Pentacles and the Three of Chalices with strength in the middle. So we have that beautiful idea of strength in that bond, right? We can see a bond here in each of these cards, and this card reminds us that there is strength in that bond. I think that's really beautiful. Let's just pull a couple more. So here we have adversity. So maybe there are some things that we need to overcome right now. And here we have the High Priestess and the Page of Athmes. That really tells us that we need to step into our own power, right? We need to step into not only our internal power, but our external power as well. In order to overcome that adversity, we need to bring those together. And one of the things that I like about a pairing such as this is that using a deck that has a lot of white space, a lot of breathing room around it, really creates space for your message to kind of breathe. It creates space for your message to really expand, where this becomes a very important focal point for this reading. I mean, when you're looking at these cards, your eye immediately goes to this adversity card. So in this sense, using decks that really contrast each other in this way really helps to create a focal point for your reading. But again, when we're talking about looking at decks in terms of their thematic use, what we're really talking about is decks that have a similar content or context. So we're talking about decks that follow the same theme, basically. So the last consideration I want to mention when looking at pairing your oracle and tarot decks together is to pair them for a specific purpose. I call this intentionally selecting your decks or purposely selecting your decks, because what you're looking for is decks that serve the same purpose in your collection. So in this instance, we're really talking about decks that serve a similar purpose or function in your collection. So for me, we have the Ember and Aura Tarot here and the Goddess Oracle. Now for me, these are both decks that I use with my self-care practice almost exclusively. So for me, these two decks are my self-care decks. They may represent something totally different in somebody else's practice, and somebody else may see this as their divine inspiration deck, and somebody may see this one as their inner power deck. So it really depends on how you approach your cards in your practice, how you use them in your practice. In this instance, we're really not worrying so much about the visual cohesion between them. We're really not worrying so much about the energy of the two decks. And we're really not focusing on decks that have a similar theme. Really what we're looking at is decks that serve the same purpose in your collection. So for this instance, because these are self-care decks for me, if I'm doing a self-care reading, what I'm going to do is lay one card from my Goddess Oracle as my focal point. This is my main message for my reading. It's the message of healing. And my tarot deck then becomes the expansion of that message. So in this particular instance, the oracle itself is what's primary. And we're using the tarot to expand upon that message. Now these two decks, if we look at it, don't really have a ton in common. They do both have some white space. Now I have trimmed the Goddess Oracle. I believe it had bigger white borders. It's been a while now. I think it has bigger white borders, so if you had left those on, you would have more white space, of course. But if you look at the art styles, they are quite different. The Goddess Oracle has really detailed, really intricate imagery, and the Ember and Aura Tarot is a little bit more primal. It's a little bit more raw. You see here, it's more, it looks like maybe some watercolor. I'm not really an expert on art mediums, but you know, we definitely have a different art style going on in the Ember and Aura Tarot than we do in the Goddess Oracle. So they have different art styles. They have kind of even different color palettes. While we do have some similarities in terms of those more pastel colors, then we have, you know, cards like Sedna here, which is very much in the blacks and the blues. And you compare that to the primary pinks and purples, the really pastel colors of the Ember and Aura Tarot. They're very different, but they do still work together for me because, again, we're back to they serve the same purpose in my practice. So when I'm looking at pairing different tarot and oracle decks together, these are the four main things that I'm really looking for. I'm looking for decks that visually go together, that look good laying together on my table, that have similar color palettes or similar art styles, that look like they were maybe created to actually go together. That's a definite consideration when I'm looking at decks that I want to pair together. Making sure that they work together visually, whether they complement each other or contrast each other, is really important to me because I need that sort of visual link between them in order to bring that into my readings. Energetically can also be another important aspect to how two decks work together. When you have decks that have similar energies, they tend to work really well together. They tend to read well together. So here we have the Tarot de St. Croix and the Empathetic Oracle, and these two decks are both kind of have a little bit of a grounded, more earthy, almost shamanic energy to them. And so they work really well together, and their messages are pretty cohesive because they share a similar energy, a similar vibe that kind of ties them together. Another thing that I tend to look for, although less than these other three considerations, is whether decks thematically fit together. I don't often use this as a criteria for my tarot and oracle pairs, but sometimes it does come into play. Sometimes you want to do a shamanic reading, so therefore you might want to use shamanic decks, or you want to do a witchy reading like we have here, so we might want to use witchy decks. So here we have the Green Witch Tarot and the Hedge Witch Botanical. Both of these are really down deep into the earth. They're really about the sort of nature magic aspect of things, and so thematically they share a same content. They share the same theme, and so they work really well together. This again is a good example of two decks that have different art styles that work really well together to create space and complement each other as well. And finally, we have decks that share a similar purpose in your collection. So while these two decks, the Goddess Oracle and the Ember and Aura Tarot, don't necessarily have anything in common visually or energetically or even thematically, they both serve the same purpose in my collection. So for me, they're both self-care decks. And that means that they work really well together in terms of using them in pairs for readings, because they both, to me, have the intention for self-care. So those are just a couple of things that you might want to look for when you're thinking about pairing your tarot and oracle decks together. We have decks that go together visually. We have decks that complement each other energetically. We have decks that share the same theme or content. And we have decks that serve the same purpose in your collection. And while they may not necessarily be thematically or energetically or visually cohesive, they serve the same purpose, so they work well together in that way. Thank you for joining me today. You will find links for the decks featured here in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this video and will join me again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.